Your sister, Helen, had always been the organized one. Her mornings were sacred, the kettle whistling at exactly 7, her favorite blue cup on the counter, and that soft hum she made while waiting for the tea to steep. But that morning was different. She stood in front of the stove staring at the kettle, her hand trembling just slightly. The whistle had stopped long ago, but she didn't move. It was as if time itself had paused, like her mind had drifted somewhere she couldn't name. When you called her name, she turned slowly. Her eyes looked lost, confused, frightened. The kind of fear you don't expect from someone who used to know everything. She whispered, "I forgot what I was doing." A silence followed. One of those moments that feel heavier than words. You brushed it off at first. Maybe she hadn't slept well. Maybe it was stress, or the weather, or just one of those days. But deep down, you felt something shift. Something subtle, but terrifying. That wasn't the first time. Lately, she'd been repeating stories. Once she left the front door unlocked all night. Another day, she called her grandson by your son's name. And when you gently corrected her, she just laughed nervously, brushing it away like dust from her sleeve. But there was something else. Something harder to explain. Her moods had changed. She snapped at small things, forgot appointments, and sometimes sat for hours staring at the garden, as if trying to remember what the flowers' names were. It wasn't just forgetfulness. It was absence. And that morning, standing there with her tea gone cold, you saw it clearly for the first time. The woman who once ran the household with precision, who remembered every birthday and recipe by heart, was slipping. Quietly. Invisibly. You reached out to hold her hand. It was cold. She smiled faintly and said, "I'm fine." But you could see it. That flicker of fear behind her eyes. Later that day, while driving home, you couldn't shake the image of her standing frozen by the kettle. You kept hearing her voice echo in your head. "I forgot what I was doing." Those words wouldn't leave you. And you wondered, was this just aging? Or was something deeper happening inside her brain? Something no one had noticed yet? The next week, she called you again. She said she'd gotten lost driving to the grocery store she'd gone to for 20 years. Her voice cracked when she told you, "I knew I was close, but nothing looked familiar." You sat in silence for a long time after hanging up. That's when it hit you. This wasn't normal forgetfulness, something was wrong. And so you decided to act, to take her to see someone, to get answers. You just didn't know yet that those answers would change everything. And you, watching this right now, have you ever noticed something similar in someone you love? A moment that felt off, a personality shift, or a memory that slipped too easily? If you have, don't ignore it. Because what happened to Helen could happen to anyone. It started slowly, so slowly that you didn't notice at first. Helen's laughter, once bright and contagious, had turned into short, distracted chuckles. She stopped finishing her sentences halfway, as if her thoughts were dissolving before they reached her lips. One day, she left the oven on. Another, she forgot to feed the cat. And then, there were the moods. Those unpredictable storms that came out of nowhere. You used to call her sunshine, remember? Always gentle, always calm. Now, a simple question. Did you take your medicine? Could make her snap, her voice trembling with anger she didn't understand. Moments later, she'd cry, confused by her own reaction. Frontotemporal dementia doesn't begin with memory, not always. Sometimes it starts with personality. The very essence of who someone is begins to fade, not just their words, but their warmth, their humor, their patience. And that's what scared you most. It wasn't the forgotten groceries or the misplaced keys. It was the way Helen stopped caring. She no longer asked about your day. She stopped calling her friends. She'd sit for hours staring at the window, eyes vacant, as if trapped inside a fog no one else could see. You remember one particular evening. You were sitting in her living room, the same one filled with family photos and the smell of lavender, when she looked at a picture of her late husband and said, "He was kind to me, wasn't he?" You froze. It wasn't just the question. It was the emptiness in her tone, like she wasn't sure if she remembered him or was simply repeating a name someone else had told her. Later that night, while helping her prepare for bed, she turned to you and whispered, "Something's wrong with me, isn't it?" And you didn't know what to say. You wanted to tell her it was just forgetfulness, that everyone slips up now and then. But deep down, you knew this was more than that. You began researching quietly, scrolling through articles and medical forums late into the night. You read about frontotemporal dementia, a type of dementia that attacks the brain's frontal and temporal lobes, the areas that control behavior, language, and personality. It often strikes people younger than 70. It steals things memory doesn't touch: empathy, control, awareness. You recognized every symptom in those descriptions: the irritability, the emotional flatness, the small but painful moments of confusion. And yet part of you wanted to deny it. Because how do you accept that someone you love, someone who taught you how to read, how to cook, how to live, might be slowly disappearing before your eyes? Days turned into weeks, and Helen's behavior became unpredictable. She laughed at things that weren't funny. She walked into the kitchen and poured orange juice into her cereal. She once put her car keys in the freezer. Each moment was like a tiny crack forming in the person she used to be. Her friends stopped visiting as often. Some didn't understand. They said she was just getting old, or that maybe she was depressed. But you knew this wasn't age. This was something darker, something stealing pieces of her from the inside out. You started writing notes for her, reminders on sticky papers, taped to the fridge, the mirror, the door. At first she followed them. Then she began to ignore them. And one day she looked at a note that said, "Lock the door before bed," and asked, "Whose handwriting is this?" That's when it hit you. She didn't even recognize your handwriting anymore. You went home that night feeling hollow. You lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if you should have noticed sooner, if maybe something could have been done. But how could you? How could anyone know when a mind begins to fade from the inside out, silently, invisibly, mercilessly? And you, watching this now, have you ever seen someone change in ways you couldn't explain? Someone who used to be full of life, now quiet, withdrawn, or strangely distant? It's easy to think it's just age, but sometimes it's the first whisper of something far more serious. Don't ignore those whispers. They're the first signs, the ones doctors beg families to notice early. It happened on a quiet Sunday morning. The kind of morning Helen used to love. Sunlight slipping through the curtains, the sound of birds outside, the smell of coffee filling the air. You had stopped by to check on her. Her house looked the same, yet something felt off. The dishes were unwashed, the curtains half closed. There was a faint smell of something burnt. You called her name. No answer. Your heart started pounding as you walked toward the kitchen. She was sitting on the floor, not crying, not speaking, just sitting, staring at a pile of toast that had turned to black smoke in the toaster. The alarm hadn't gone off. Or maybe it had, and she hadn't noticed. Her hands were trembling, her eyes distant. You knelt beside her, gently touching her shoulder. She looked at you, and for a split second, her face softened, like recognition was fighting to surface. Then she said the words that tore you apart. "I don't know who you are." You froze. Your throat went dry. Every sound in the room disappeared. The ticking clock, the hum of the fridge, gone. All that remained was the echo of those 6 words. She didn't mean it cruelly. She wasn't angry. She was lost. Completely and utterly lost inside her own mind. You tried to remind her. You said your name, over and over, your voice trembling. You showed her an old photo from your phone, the 2 of you at the lake last summer, laughing, covered in ice cream. Her eyes flickered for a moment, then nothing. She whispered, "I'm sorry," and began to cry. That was the moment you knew. This wasn't something she could just snap out of. This was something deeper, something that had taken root inside her brain and was slowly erasing everything that made her Helen. You helped her to the couch, wrapped her in a blanket, and called her doctor. Your hands were shaking as you dialed. You could barely speak. The nurse on the other end told you to bring her in the next day. That night, Helen wouldn't sleep. She paced around the house, mumbling fragments of conversations that didn't make sense. At one point, she tried to leave, saying she needed to pick up the kids. Her children were grown, one living in Chicago, another in Seattle. You blocked the door gently, tears welling up in your eyes. She looked at you again, confused, like you were both strangers trapped in the same dream. "Why are you crying?" she asked. You smiled weakly. "Because I miss you," you whispered. But she didn't understand. Later that night, when she finally fell asleep on the couch, you sat beside her in silence. Her breathing was shallow, uneven. You studied her face, the faint wrinkles, the gray hair, the familiar freckles near her temple, and it broke your heart to realize she was still there, but fading piece by piece. That's the cruel thing about frontotemporal dementia. It doesn't take someone all at once. It takes them in fragments, and a memory here, a word there, until what's left is a shell of who they used to be. And as you sat there watching her sleep, a single question looped through your mind. Is this the beginning of the end? You thought of all the little signs you'd missed, the changes you brushed aside, the days you told yourself, it's just age. Now, sitting in that dimly lit room, you knew there was no going back. Tomorrow, you'd face doctors, tests, and names for things you wished you'd never have to learn. But tonight was just you and her, and the silence between you that said everything words couldn't. And maybe, if you're honest, part of you was scared for yourself too. Because when someone you love begins to fade, you start wondering if one day you might fade too. And you, watching this, have you ever had a moment when someone close to you didn't recognize you? A moment so painful, so surreal, that it left a scar you can't describe. That's what dementia does. It doesn't just steal memories. It steals the connections that make life worth remembering. The waiting room smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee. You could hear the low hum of conversation, the shuffle of papers, the distant clicking of a keyboard. Helen sat beside you, hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression calm, too calm, almost childlike. She didn't seem nervous, but you were. Every muscle in your body felt tense, as if bracing for something you already feared but didn't want to name. When the doctor called her name, she stood up slowly, smiling politely. You followed her into the small consultation room, white walls, a faint buzzing light overhead, a framed degree from Harvard Medical School. The doctor's voice was kind but steady, the kind of voice that tries to sound reassuring but carries the weight of bad news beneath it. He asked Helen a series of questions, simple ones at first. What year is it? Can you tell me today's date? Who is the president? She hesitated. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for answers that weren't there. You could see the confusion building like fog behind her eyes. When he asked her to draw a simple clock, she smiled awkwardly and began sketching. At first, it looked fine. But when she placed all the numbers on one side of the circle, your stomach dropped. The doctor nodded gently, taking notes. He then asked her to recall a list of 3 words: apple, chair, penny. She repeated them after him. 2 minutes later, she couldn't remember any of them. You felt your throat tighten. You wanted to stop the test, to say, "She's tired, that's all." But you knew what you were seeing. After the assessment, the doctor leaned forward. He spoke slowly, carefully, each word landing like a weight. I believe what we're seeing are early signs of frontotemporal dementia, FTD. The words hung in the air. You had read that phrase before late at night on your phone. But hearing it spoken aloud, frontotemporal dementia felt different, like a verdict. Helen frowned slightly, tilting her head. So, it's memory loss? The doctor nodded softly. In part, but with FTD, it's not just memory. It affects behavior, personality, language, even emotions. You glanced at Helen, hoping she understood. But she was looking at her hands, tracing the lines on her palm as if they might tell her a different story. "Is there a cure?" you asked quietly. The doctor sighed. "Not yet, but there are treatments that can help slow progression, manage symptoms, and improve quality of life. What matters most now is support, routines, exercise, nutrition, and emotional care." He handed you a pamphlet. You didn't want to look at it, but you took it anyway. The title read, "Living with Frontotemporal Dementia, a Guide for Families." The word living was both comforting and cruel. Helen smiled faintly at the doctor. "I don't feel sick," she said softly. "You're not sick," he replied. "Your brain is just changing, but we can work with it." As you left the office, she seemed oddly peaceful, like she didn't fully grasp what had been said. But you did. Every syllable was carved into your mind. On the drive home, she looked out the window, watching the passing trees. The sunlight flickered across her face, and for a brief moment, she looked like her old self again, curious, thoughtful, alive. Then she said, almost casually, "At least now I know why I forget things." You nodded, gripping the steering wheel tightly. She didn't notice the tears in your eyes. That night, you sat alone at your kitchen table, the pamphlet spread open in front of you. It listed symptoms, stages, and support networks, all clinical, all cold. But buried near the bottom, in small print, were the words that stuck with you. "There is no cure, but there is care, and care makes all the difference." You closed your eyes and took a deep breath. You couldn't change what was coming. But maybe, just maybe, you could change how she faced it. And you watching this, if you've ever sat in a doctor's office holding your breath, waiting for words you didn't want to hear, you know this feeling. That moment when life divides into before and after. But remember this, even when there's no cure, there's always care. And sometimes care is what keeps love alive. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. You had taken Helen to the park, her favorite place, the one with the old oak tree and the bench that faced the lake. The autumn air was cool, and the light had that golden softness that makes everything look gentler than it is. She seemed calm that day, quiet, but calm. She watched the ducks glide across the water, her hands resting still on her lap. For a moment, it felt like the world had slowed down enough for you both to breathe. That's when a woman sat down beside you, an older lady with kind eyes and a colorful scarf. Her name was Clara. She smiled at Helen, then at you, as if she could sense the heaviness in the air. "She's beautiful," Clara said softly. "Your sister?" You nodded. "Yes, she's been having a hard time lately." Clara's smile faded a little. "Memory?" You hesitated, surprised. "Yes, how did you—" "My husband had something similar," she said. "Frontotemporal dementia. The doctor said there wasn't much we could do, but I learned that small things matter. More than we realize." You leaned in, curious despite yourself. "Small things?" Clara nodded. "The brain's like a garden," she said. "You can't stop the seasons from changing, but you can still plant things that grow." You sat there quietly, listening. Something about her voice, a warm, grounded, made you believe her. "We started focusing on foods that feed the brain," Clara continued. "Things rich in omega-3s, turmeric, blueberries, olive oil. Every day, just small amounts. We cut out processed sugars, added morning walks, meditation. It wasn't magic, but he became calmer, more focused. He started smiling again." You glanced at Helen, who was now looking at a small child throwing bread to the ducks. For the first time in days, she was smiling too. Clara looked at you knowingly. People forget that the brain's still alive. It responds to care, to nourishment. Even in dementia, there's room for light. Her words sank deep. They weren't promises. They were possibilities. She handed you a small notebook. I wrote down some of the things that helped us. Maybe it can help her too. You thanked her, your voice trembling a little. Inside the notebook were simple notes. Turmeric tea every morning. Blueberries and walnuts. Sleep before 10 p.m. 10 minutes of sunlight. Talk, even when she forgets. The heart remembers what the mind loses. You read those words again and again that night. They didn't sound like medical advice, and they sounded like love, translated into habits. That same evening, you brewed a small cup of turmeric tea for Helen. The scent filled the kitchen, warm, earthy, comforting. She wrinkled her nose and laughed. It smells strange. Try it, you said, smiling. It's good for you. She took a sip, grimaced, then smiled faintly. Not bad. You added blueberries to her breakfast the next morning. You played her favorite old songs, Sinatra, Patsy Cline, and watched her hum along. You noticed small things, the way her face softened, the way she slept a little better, the way she laughed at something on TV and seemed to get the joke again. It wasn't a miracle. It was something gentler, subtler. A quiet shift, like the first light before sunrise. You began to believe what Clara had said. Maybe the brain, like a garden, could still bloom if you learned how to tend it. And you, watching this right now, have you ever dismissed something too simple to make a difference? Sometimes the simplest habits, a walk, a handful of nuts, a quiet conversation, are the ones that save us. Because healing isn't always about reversing what's lost. Sometimes it's about nurturing what remains. The first week didn't feel like much. You followed Clara's notebook almost like scripture. The turmeric tea in the morning, the handful of blueberries after breakfast, the short walks before sunset. Helen didn't complain. She didn't ask why you were doing it either. She just went along, her trust quiet and unspoken. At first, nothing seemed to change. The confusion lingered. Some days she still forgot where she'd placed her keys or why she'd opened a drawer. But then, something began to shift. Small things, the kind you almost miss if you're not looking closely. It started one morning when she greeted you at the door with a smile. Not the vacant, polite smile you'd grown used to, but the kind that reached her eyes. "You're early today," she said. You blinked. She hadn't remembered time or plans in weeks. Later that day, you caught her humming while folding laundry. It was an old song, Blue Skies. Her voice cracked a little, but the melody was there. You leaned against the doorframe watching her, your chest tightening with something you hadn't felt in months, hope. The next week, she started helping in the kitchen again. She cut vegetables, slowly, carefully, and asked you, "Do you remember how Mom used to add bay leaves to the soup?" You almost dropped the spoon. It wasn't just memory. It was connection. Something was waking up inside her. You didn't want to overthink it. You didn't want to jinx it. But even her mood seemed softer. The anger that used to flare so easily had quieted. She laughed more. And once, when you told her a story about your childhood, she interrupted you mid-sentence and said, "That's not how it happened." You cried that day. You both burst out laughing. It was such a simple moment, yet you found yourself crying afterward. Because when someone begins to disappear, even a single spark of recognition feels like a miracle. You noticed her sleep improving too. No more restless pacing, no more nights spent staring at the ceiling. She fell asleep faster, her breathing deep and even. You started sleeping better too. Every morning she'd sip her tea and look out the window, sunlight spilling across her face. "It feels good to be awake," she said one day. You smiled. It always does. And you didn't tell her about the research you'd been reading late at night. Studies from Harvard and Stanford suggesting that curcumin, the compound in turmeric, may reduce brain inflammation, that blueberries and olive oil support cognitive function, that daily movement helps the brain build new connections. You didn't want to turn her healing into data. You just wanted to live it. Still, deep down, you knew these weren't coincidences. They were quiet proofs that the brain, even damaged, could respond to love, nourishment, and rhythm. It wasn't a cure, but it was something better than despair. One afternoon, your phone rang. It was Clara. "How's she doing?" You smiled before answering. "Better. Not perfect, but better." Clara chuckled. "Perfection's overrated. Progress, that's the real miracle." You hung up and walked to the living room where Helen was sitting by the window, knitting something you hadn't seen her touch in months. A small blue scarf. She looked up at you and said, "It's for you." You nodded, your throat tight, your heart heavier and lighter all at once. That night you wrote in your journal, something you hadn't done since the diagnosis. Maybe healing doesn't mean going back. Maybe it just means finding your way forward. And you, Sai, watching this right now, maybe you know someone like Helen. Maybe you've watched them fade and wished for a miracle. But sometimes, healing begins quietly, with one meal, one walk, one loving hand guiding them home again. Because even in the fog of memory loss, love still leaves light. You'd always trusted doctors and their words, their charts, their calm confidence. But after Helen's diagnosis, something shifted inside you. You began searching, reading late into the night, driven not by denial but by love. You wanted to understand why these small habits, the turmeric, the blueberries, the walks, were helping. And what you found changed how you saw everything. At first, you stumbled across a short article from Harvard Health Publishing. It said that inflammation in the brain plays a critical role in many forms of dementia, including frontotemporal dementia. It explained in simple words that reducing this inflammation could slow the progression of cognitive decline. You paused. Inflammation, that invisible fire inside the brain. Could something as ordinary as food help cool it down? You dug deeper. A study from Stanford University showed that compounds found in turmeric, called curcuminoids, might protect brain cells by neutralizing those inflammatory signals. Another paper from the NIH mentioned that curcumin can cross the blood-brain barrier, something most nutrients can't do easily. That meant it could actually reach the brain directly, like sending a firefighter into the heart of the fire. And then came the blueberries. Research from Harvard Medical School had found that blueberries are packed with anthocyanins, powerful antioxidants that can help improve memory and communication between brain cells. Scientists called them neuroprotective. You just called them hope in a bowl. It all made sense now. The calmness, the clarity, the small bursts of recognition, they weren't miracles. They were biology responding to kindness. But it wasn't just food. You learned that movement mattered too. A study from the National Institute on Aging revealed that even gentle daily walks could increase the brain's oxygen flow, supporting the growth of new neural pathways, a process known as neuroplasticity. In plain words, the brain could still adapt, still build, still fight back. And sleep, that simple, often neglected gift, turned out to be one of the strongest medicines of all. Researchers at Johns Hopkins had found that during deep sleep, the brain literally washes itself, clearing out toxins and misfolded proteins that contribute to cognitive decline. When Helen began sleeping better, she wasn't just resting. Her brain was cleaning itself. You began to see it all differently. The turmeric tea wasn't just a drink. The blueberries weren't just breakfast. The walk wasn't just routine. They were each a small act of defiance, a refusal to surrender to what medicine once called irreversible. And for the first time since the diagnosis, you felt empowered. Because even though the doctor had said there was no cure, science was quietly whispering something else. There is still possibility. You started writing everything down, not as a caregiver, but as a witness. The studies, the meals, the changes. You filled pages with names like Harvard, Stanford, NIH, institutions that once felt far away, now standing invisibly beside you, helping you fight for your sister's mind. One evening, as you were reading an article on neuroplasticity, Helen walked in holding 2 mugs of tea. "You're studying again?" she said with a smile. "Trying to understand you," you replied. She handed you a cup. "Good luck." "I'm still trying to understand myself." You both laughed, the kind of laugh that feels like sunlight after rain. And in that moment you realized something profound. You didn't need to fix her. You just needed to walk beside her. To keep showing up, with warmth, patience, and maybe a little turmeric. And you, watching this right now, maybe you've been told there's nothing more you can do. But science says otherwise. Every small, consistent act, a nutrient, a walk, a conversation, can shape how the brain ages. The body listens, the brain adapts. Hope is not naive, it's biological. Because even when the cure doesn't exist yet, care still changes chemistry. The days began to find rhythm again. It wasn't perfect. Some mornings were slower than others. Some memories slipped away like smoke. But there was structure now. And in that structure, there was peace. Helen's mornings became rituals, sacred in their simplicity. She'd start the day with her turmeric tea, a warm, golden swirl that filled the kitchen with its earthy scent. You'd watch her stir it slowly, her hands steady now, her eyes focused. "Smells like sunshine," she'd say with a faint smile. Then came breakfast, oatmeal topped with blueberries and walnuts. She didn't just eat, she enjoyed it. Every spoonful was mindful, deliberate, like she was feeding more than just her body. You knew she was feeding her future. After breakfast, she'd slip on her old sneakers, the ones with the faded pink laces, and wait by the door for your walk. At first, she resisted, said she didn't feel like going out, that her legs were tired, but you insisted, gently. "Just 10 minutes," you said. "Let's feel the air." And slowly she began to love it. The sunlight on her face, the crisp wind brushing her hair, the rhythm of her steps syncing with yours. You'd walk past the same houses, the same trees, the same park bench, and each day she remembered a little more. "There's the lady with the red door," she'd say one morning. "And that dog, we saw him yesterday." Those small recognitions became milestones, tiny victories disguised as ordinary moments. In the afternoons, she'd sit by the window with her knitting again. Sometimes she'd hum old songs. Other times, she'd just watch the world. Children running, neighbors chatting, leaves swaying in the wind. You realized that even silence, when filled with peace, could be healing. Evenings were for stories. You'd read aloud, not medical articles anymore, but things she loved. Short stories, travel journals, sometimes poetry. She didn't always follow every line, but she listened. Her face softened, her breathing slowed, and sometimes she'd whisper a word or two from memory, a line from a poem you both knew by heart. And then came the part that surprised you most. She began helping you. When you were tired, she'd brew the tea herself. When you looked worried, she'd touch your hand and say, "You're doing a good job, you know that?" It caught you off guard every time, how the caregiver was now being cared for. You realized something then. Healing isn't always about reversal. Sometimes it's about rebuilding differently. The routines that once felt forced had become rituals of love, invisible threads tying you both back to life. You even started adding small things to her day. Gentle puzzles, word games, a little gardening. She'd laugh when she forgot the name of a flower, then invent her own. "This one's called Sunny Bloom," she'd declare, holding up a daisy. And in a way, she was right. Everything she touched seemed to hold a little more light now. You could see it, in her posture, her tone, her presence. The fog wasn't gone, not completely, but it had lifted enough to let the sun through. And maybe that was enough. One evening, while you were both sitting on the porch, Helen looked at you and said, "You know, I used to be afraid of getting old, but now, I think it's just another way to learn how to live." You smiled, trying not to cry. "You're still learning," you said softly. "We both are." She nodded, sipping her tea. The sunset bathed everything in gold, the same color as the turmeric in her cup. And for the first time in a long time, you didn't feel like you were fighting something. You felt like you were flowing with it, gently, gratefully. And you, watching this, maybe you're walking through something similar. Maybe you've been carrying the weight of someone's illness, or your own. Here's what Helen taught you. Healing isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. It's in the tea you make, The walk you take, the story you tell again and again, because even when memory fades, routine remembers. It had been 6 months since that day in the doctor's office. The diagnosis that once sounded like a sentence had become a chapter. You didn't notice it changing at first. Healing never announces itself. It arrives quietly, like morning light through a half-closed curtain. Helen's world wasn't perfect, but it was brighter. She laughed again. She remembered small things, names, songs, recipes, and more than that, she remembered herself. One morning, you came by with groceries. The door was already open, and the smell of something cooking drifted through the hallway. Olive oil, garlic, herbs. For a moment you froze. That smell was her signature, the scent of your childhood. You walked into the kitchen. She was standing there, apron tied crookedly, stirring a pot of soup. "Smells amazing," you said, smiling. She turned, eyes bright. "I found Mom's old recipe box," she said. "Thought I'd try one for dinner." You blinked, tears pricking at the corners of your eyes. "Do you remember it?" She smiled. "Not all of it, but I remember how it made us feel." You sat together at the table, tasting the soup, a little too salty, but perfect in every way that mattered. You realized then, it wasn't about memory, it was about meaning. Later that week, your nephew came to visit, Helen's grandson. He hadn't seen her since before the diagnosis. When he ran through the door shouting, "Grandma!" she froze for half a second, and then her face lit up. "Eli," she said softly, her voice trembling, "you've grown taller." He threw his arms around her, laughing. "You remembered my name." You turned away for a moment, pretending to wipe your glasses, but it wasn't the glasses, it was your eyes. That single word, remembered, felt like grace. You saw the pride in her expression, the spark of recognition that had once been buried under fear. For that instant, dementia didn't win, love did. From then on, Helen began to participate more actively in her life. She kept a small notebook, her memory book, she called it. Each day she'd write simple things. Walked with my sister. Had tea with honey. Sunset was pink. Some pages had doodles, shaky but joyful. Others had nothing but a single word, thankful. You read it sometimes when she wasn't looking. It felt like peeking into her soul, fragmented but full of light. Her doctor noticed the difference too. Her mood had stabilized, her awareness improved. He couldn't explain it completely. He used words like neuroplasticity and holistic response, but you didn't need explanations. You had seen it happen with your own eyes. One evening, you both sat outside watching the stars. The air was cool, the crickets soft in the distance. She was wrapped in the blue scarf she'd knitted months ago, the one she made for you. "You know," she said quietly, "I used to think my life was ending. But now, I think it's just changing shape." You looked at her, tears threatening again. "You've come a long way," you whispered. She smiled faintly. "Maybe I just needed a reason to keep walking." You thought about Clara's words, "The brain's a garden. You can't stop the seasons, but you can still plant things that grow." Helen was living proof of that. Her garden hadn't stopped blooming. It had simply learned to grow around the shadows. When you left that night, she hugged you tightly. "Thank you," she said, "for not giving up on me." You hugged her back. You never gave up on yourself. Driving home, you realized that second chances don't always come as grand gestures or sudden miracles. Sometimes they come in teaspoons of turmeric, in morning walks, in shared laughter. Sometimes they come in remembering a single name. And you, watching this, maybe you've been told it's too late, that the mind can't heal, that what's lost is gone forever. But Helen's story is proof of something else. Even in decline, there is resilience. Even in forgetting, there can be rediscovery. Even in silence, there can still be song. Because life doesn't end with a diagnosis. Sometimes that's where it finally begins. It's strange, isn't it? How life can change in quiet ways. One day it feels like everything's slipping through your fingers. The faces, the places, the names. And then, little by little, something shifts. Not everything comes back. But what does feels even more precious. Helen isn't the same as she once was. You both know that. There are still hard days, moments when she stares into the distance searching for words that won't come. But now, those moments are surrounded by others. Moments of laughter, of light, of remembering how to be. You've stopped counting the things she's lost. You've started noticing the things she still has. Like the way her eyes soften when she sees the sunrise. Or how she still hums that same tune when she waters the garden. Or how she says your name. Not always right away, but with warmth when it comes. You've learned that healing doesn't always mean going back. Sometimes it means learning how to love differently. Slower, gentler, more present. One afternoon, while sitting together under the oak tree at the park, the same one where you met Clara, Helen looked up and said, "Do you think the brain ever truly forgets?" You paused, thinking. "Maybe it forgets facts," you said, "but not feelings." She smiled. "Then I'm not afraid anymore." That smile stayed with you long after you drove her home, because maybe that's the truth. Even when memories fade, love remains, carved into us like light through glass. You find yourself thinking about all the people who might be going through the same thing. People sitting beside someone they love, watching them fade, feeling helpless. You wish you could tell them what Helen taught you, that it's never too late to care. That care is medicine. That presence is therapy. That hope is not naive, and it's necessary. So if you're watching this right now and you've noticed the signs, the confusion, the mood changes, the forgotten words, don't ignore them. Pay attention, talk, ask questions, reach out for help. Because the earlier you notice, the more you can do. And even when there's no cure, there's always care. There are foods that nourish the brain. Turmeric, blueberries, olive oil, walnuts. There are habits that keep it alive. Movement, laughter, sunlight, sleep. And there's something science still can't measure. Love. That quiet, unwavering force that can hold a person steady when their world begins to fall apart. You remember Clara's words that first day in the park. The brain's like a garden. You can't stop the seasons, but you can still plant things that grow. Now you believe her more than ever, because you've seen it. The garden blooming again inside Helen. Not the same as before, but beautiful in a new way. And maybe that's what second chances really are. Not a return to what was, but a reimagining of what still can be. Pause. Slow, reflective. So, if this story touched you, if it reminded you of someone you love or someone you've lost, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Talk about it. Start the conversation about memory, aging, and natural care. Because silence helps no one. But stories like Helen's, can save someone's tomorrow. Do you ever forget small things lately? A name, a date, a thought mid-sentence? Don't ignore it. Write it down. Talk to someone. Take care of your mind like you take care of your heart. And if you've ever helped someone through this journey, thank you. You're the quiet heroes of this story. Remember, it's not too late to start caring for your brain, and it's never too late to start caring for someone else's. Because no matter what science says, hope is the most powerful medicine we have.